Hello and welcome to the 14th video of my Pygame tutorial. Now, what I want to do here is before I get started into the real stuff, which is going to be working on buttons, so that we can click them to when we go to our intro menu, we click the play button and the game starts. So before we do that, I just want to change up the intro menu so it looks a little bit better for when we actually add the buttons onto it. And to do that, it's just going to have to add a couple of things. First off, we're going to have to say game window dot fill white, or what I should be saying is self dot game window if I remember correctly. Self dot game window fill with utils dot white. That way we just clear the screen before we update it. And inside of it, we're basically going to be doing pretty much this whole thing. So I'm just going to grab a copy of what we did in the pause menu because we're going to be adding some text. So we'll copy that, except our text isn't going to be paused. It's going to be, whatever your game name actually is. So what should we call our game? Tutorial game. Render it as nice large, except I am going to change up its centering position. So what I have here is textrect.center equals the center. And then what I'm actually going to do is just push this up by saying textrect dot y minus equals, I don't know, maybe 100, just to kind of center it more, or put it more up so it has more space for the buttons. So now if we run this, we should be able to see nothing. That's awkward. Oh, it's because we're not even blitting it, are we? Yeah, we're not blitting this text at all. So self.gamewindow.blit text at textrect. And now that we're blitting it, it should all work. There we go, tutorial game. Nice big text. Of course, we could mess with the fonts. It might be a little bit big since it's 2 words now. And I think I'm going to move it up a little bit more. So instead of just 100, let's do 200. And let's change this up to be a little bit smaller, say 82. See how that looks? Of course, it's all trial and error until we get it somewhere we like it. Yeah, I guess that works. So that'll be good for now. And now my plan for this right now is to put, some buttons right about in this middle-ish zone. So that, we have a play button at top, maybe an options button if we have any options for the game, and maybe a quit button in case our user doesn't like to hit this X over here to quit out. So I'm going to kind of show you an example of what we're going to be doing this video. So my plans are to kind of lead you through what a button is, what a text button is to start with, which is this button right here. It has text on it. What a normal button is, which doesn't have anything on it. And then what the button is being derived from, which is what I'm going to just call a clickable rect or a clickable rectangle. So as you see, we have a text button. When we click on it, it says text button clicked. When we click and hold, the color changes to, give us that signal that it's been clicked, so you have visual confirmation. We have a normal button, which does the exact same thing as the text button, but it doesn't have the text. That's the only difference. And of course, if you see down in the console, they say different things when they're clicked, so they each have their own action on how they work. And then we have this clickable rect. As you know, when I mouse over these two buttons, they highlight a little bit. You can see them turn a little bit lighter. Hopefully you can see that well enough on YouTube. But then this black box doesn't, and I've actually kept this black box black specifically so that you can see it. It could just be white in the background and you could click it and something would happen. But when I click the black box, there's no feedback, there's no understanding that I'm even mousing over it, but it's saying the clickable rect was clicked. The buttons have feedback and the text button has text on side of the button. This is what we're going to work on creating. Alright, so to get started, I've already created a couple of things just to save a little bit of time, and that's going to be 3 classes. The first class is the clickable rect, which was that black box you saw in the example, the button, which was the button without text, and then we have the text button, which is the button with text. Now, I've tried this a couple of ways, and I think that because we haven't done anything with inheritance yet in this tutorial, this is going to be easiest to actually start with the clickable rect. Even though the text button and button classes are much simpler, than the clickableRect, I still think it's going to be easier to start from the clickableRect and then move down to show you how the button inherits stuff from the rect and how the text button inherits stuff from both of them. So for this, I'm going to start with the clickableRect. Now, the clickableRect has only a couple of features in its initializer. Like, pretty much only two major things need to be initialized: a rectangle and a trigger to make sure we know if it's been clicked or not. So we're going to say self.rect, and this is going to be equal to a pygame.rect, and inside the pygame.rect, we're going to have what this thing is. Now, the rect takes two arguments. It takes the top left corner, or, the X and Y locations, as well as the width and the height. Those are the four arguments it takes. Now, we don't want to define a clickable rect inside of its initializer. Unlike the enemy, they can be different. And it's not so much that they're going to be randomly different, it's that they're going to be different in how we want them to be when we create them. So say down here when we actually create the rectangle, when we say rect equals a clickable rect, this is where we would want to define the stuff. We would want to define, some type of position and then some type of size. Those are the things we want to give it because we want to tell it, okay, how big is this rectangle or how big is this button and where do we want the button to go? So these are the two things we need to give it, a position and a size. And I'm actually going to stick those into the rectangle because it's going to be built off the position and the size, which are something we're going to pass through it. So position and size. And what are the actual position and size going to be? Well, the position for this example is we want it to be centered. So to do that is we need to say for the X argument, which, X and Y, those are the two arguments of our tuple. For the X argument, we are going to be using GameWindow.getRect.center X. And that's going to center it along the X axis for the X position of this. Meaning that this thing isn't going to be centered necessarily along the X axis because this is creating the rect at a position. What we could do is we could say position minus size, but technically this will skew it to the left a little bit because the top left corner will be in the center of the screen. So this might actually be better just to call this 0, 0. And then down here, say self.rect.center equals position. In which case now its center will be equal to the center of the game window. So we center that at X. And for the Y component, we say the same thing, GameWindow.getRect.center Y, except this time, because I want to build it like the example I showed, I'm going to minus this by 100. And then for the size, it's going to be another tuple. This is going to be 200 wide by 80 tall. And now we're defining the position and the size. Of course, they're both tuples. And here we have the rectangle. So all the clickable rect is some rectangle, which we're going to be putting a little bit above the center of the screen, the game window. And the second component was the trigger or the latch to make sure we know if we've clicked or not. And I'm just going to call that self.hasClicked. And you might have seen this from a previous example, but I hadn't actually talked about it. And self.hasClicked is false by default because we haven't clicked yet. When we create the button or we create the rectangle, we have not clicked at this moment in time. So the clickable rect, this is all that you need to build on it. The rest of the stuff happen in its update. Let's create an update for it. Define update. For the update, all we're going to say right now is pass, because I want to show you guys some inheritance before we actually start getting into, the clicking action and the mouse over action. So with any image, such as our enemies that we've created, how we've created our player, we've created our enemy, we have these two basic components. We have an image and a rectangle. And in the image and the rectangle, that's what we draw to the screen. So let's actually create our button now, or at least start working on our button. But first we're going to say our button inherits a clickable rect. So class button, and inside these parentheses, we're going to say clickable rect. And this is going to cause it to inherit this up here. And now we just have to match the initializer. So we have to say it takes a position and a size. But for the button, because the button has an image, it's not just a rectangle, let's also give it a color. So we can define the color of the button when we create the button. So now that we have those, all we have to do is call the initializer of the clickableRect by saying clickableRect dot underscore double underscore init self. We're going to pass the position and the size to the clickableRect, and that's all. Now what this is doing is when we create our button, because it inherits clickableRect, it needs to create a clickableRect object before it creates itself. So when we call this and we give it the position and the size, that's where the clickableRect is getting its position and size. So when we're down in the button and we want to create a new button, such as button equals a new button, when we give it some type of size, such as GameWindow.getRect.centerX and GameWindow.getRect.centerY, that's where it's getting its position. It's going to create a rectangle at that position, and then we're going to, of course, tell it to create an image. Now, we have a position, we also need to give it a size. I'm going to go with the same size, so 200 by 80, and our button requires a color, and I'm just going to use red for this example. So we're going to add a red color. And now let's finish actually creating the button. So the first thing the button does is it's going to create a clickable rectangle. So we're going to get a self.rect out of it. We're going to basically create a self.rect for us. All right, that means we don't need to worry about that aspect of our button. All we need to do is worry about a self.image. And this is going to be a pygame.surface of whatever the size is. So we're just going to pass in size. And since size is a tuple, we don't have to put it in its own brackets. And there we go. Now we have the size of our rectangle, or the size of our image. So we have an image, and we are inheriting from the clickableRect a rectangle. Because when you look at this rect right here as our variable, rect is a clickable rectangle at a position with a size. That's what clickableRect is. A button, or button, our variable name button, is a button. What a button is a button is a clickable rect with an image. This is a different clickable rect than, of course, just our rect variable. Our rect variable is just a clickable rect. Our button is itself a button, which is a clickable rect in an image. Those are the two pieces of it. Which is the same thing to say as a text button is just going to be a button with text. There's pretty much no difference. So of course, our button, might need some more functions later on. But for now, I believe, well, our button does need one more function so that we can actually see it. And that's going to be define draw. And draw is just going to say GameWindow.blit self.image to self.rect. Now you might notice self.rect right here doesn't give me an error because we're actually using the self.rect from the clickableRect. Even though button, the image of a button class, does not have something called self.rect, it inherits something that does, which means it has access to it. So we have our draw, and I'm going to define one more function, define update. And all update is going to do is say self.draw. And I'm actually going to pass the game window through this just because this is how most of our update functions work in our game. Even though that's not how this example works, I'm going to do it anyway. So that this is how we get our game window. All updates have to match if they're inherited. So we just have to put game window onto the update for the clickableRect just so that it gets, passed through. So I believe that this is all we need to do for now. I should be able to run this and we should be able to see at least the button being drawn. So let's see, it is running. There we go. Just took a second to open up. And no button just yet. And that is because we have not drawn the thing. So self.image.fill with the color. There, now it should work. And it's still not working. Oh, it's because we're not updating it. So we're not filling it with a color and we're not updating it. So let's call rect.update because we created a rect object. It takes a game window and button.update with a game window as well. Now, third time's the charm, we have our red box. Now, it's not a button yet because we can't click it, but it's there. It's being drawn and it's being drawn in the correct location based off the inherited rect. Now let's actually look at a text button. So the text button is going to inherit button. So we're going to add button right here. Now, because the text button inherits button, what is a button? Well, a button is a clickable rect with an image. So the text button is going to inherit a clickable rect and an image from the button. And of course, a clickable rect has a rectangle, which is, good because that'll allow us to keep using the button. So let's define all the things we need. We need a position, we need a size, we need a color, just so that we can pass all these things to the button to make the button happy. And because it's a text button, I guess we also need some text, just so that, we can type something on top of our button. And the first thing we need to call is button. In itself, we need to give the button a position, a size, and a color. And we save the text for ourselves. Button.init, position, size, color. It's everything. Why is it giving me parameter color unfilled? Oh, that's just an error because we haven't filled out the button down here when we create the object. We'll get to that in a moment. So, a text button is a button. We're creating the button right here with a position, size, and a color. That's our button object. And some type of text, so self.text. And what should self.text be? Well, I have getFont. I suppose we can make this larger. Size equals maybe 36 will be a good size. And style equals bold, just so you guys can see it better. .render, whatever the text we pass through is true, and we'll go with black for the color of the text. Now, if we wanted to, we could do a text color as another parameter. That's optional, but I think black text will work for now. And that's all we're going to do for the text. This is all we're going to do for the text button. So now let's fill out the parameter. Of course, we're going to do very similar things as previously. GameWindow.getRect, .centerX, GameWindow.getRect, .centerY plus 100 this time, so it's offset toward the bottom. We need to give it a size, so 200 by 80. We need to give it a color. We'll go with red again, or do we want to? Yeah, we'll go with red again, just so that we don't complicate things too much. And we need to give it some type of text. So let's just call it button 3 for now. Just because, maybe that's the name of our button. Maybe we want button 1, button 2, button 3, button 4, depending on how many we have. We just want to give them a name. So now we just have to call the update for it, and it should draw. So text button.update. Now you'll note game text button doesn't have an update function, but we can call update because the way this thing works, and let's see, it's still giving us an error for this. Parameter color is unfilled. Oh, the reason it's giving us this error is because we're not using self as our first argument. There we go. Now it should be working, so we should be able to run this. So I can show you this, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later. So first off, you'll notice it's not drawing properly, but it is there. It has an image, even though it, in a way, doesn't have an image. So the way that this looks, and the reason it's also updating, is just the way that inheritance works. So let's talk about text button for a moment, right? Text button.update to the game window. Well, the computer it'll go to text button, and it goes, okay, I need to call my update function. What's my update function? I don't have one. Okay, I'm inheriting button. Let's see if he has one. And then it comes up to button, and it goes, okay, I'm at button. It has an update function. What does update function do? Well, it calls draw. And then it goes to the draw function. It goes, okay, button, or it would go back to text button, go, okay, I need a draw function. I don't have a draw function. So now it comes back to button, the first thing up in the hierarchy of the inheritance, and it goes, I need a draw function. Oh, look, here's one. What we're going to do is we're going to blit an image to a rect. And it's going to go, okay, I can do that. I'm good at this. Comes back to text button, goes, okay, I need to take an image. Okay, you don't have an image. Let's go to the first thing you inherit. Goes to the button. Okay, I need an image. Here's my image. So I found it right here. So I'll blit this thing to a rect. Okay, now I need a self.rect. Comes back to the text button, goes, okay, you don't have a rect. Goes to the first thing it inherits, or the first thing that is being inherited by its closest parent. Goes to button and goes, I need a rect. Goes, okay, you don't have a rect here either. Let's go to this thing's parent and see if we can find a rect. Comes up to clickable button, finds the rect and goes, okay, I'm going to use that. That's a very complicated chain of how this thing works, but that's essentially how it's getting all of its components. So it calls its update, which calls draw, and that's how it draws itself. Now, it's drawing improperly, and that's because we're not blitting text anywhere. This is easily fixed. So let's define draw. Now what this draw is going to do is it's actually going to override the button's draw. So if you look here, there's actually a thing called overrides method in button, and then if we go up to button, it says is overridden in text button. That means this draw is overriding this draw. So if text button ever calls a self.draw, then it's going to use this version instead. So what is this version going to do? Well, draw just splits the image. That's not good. That's not going to work for us. What we need to do first is we need to say self.image.blit self.text to, let's go with, I don't know, 1010. And then we can do the game window .blit. Or say we had some type of animation being drawn in the button where we had a lot of lines, say this draw function had a lot of lines in it. Instead of just blitting it here and completely overriding it, what we can also do is we can actually say button.draw self and then give it the game window. And in which case, what this will do is this will actually use the buttons draw method afterwards, but with the text object, because that's what we're doing is passing in self. We're using the text button object on the buttons draw. Of course, we need to do a game window for this to work, so we can call game window, and then it all works out. So now the text should show up when we run this thing. Boom, big text of button 3 is showing up. Because how it's working is now, when we get to that stage where we go to update, remember, it looks at text button, goes, okay, I need to update. I can't do that. Let's look at my closest parent. It has an update function. It's calling draw. Okay, let's go back to text button and look for a draw function. Oh look, I have a draw function this time, so I'm going to blit my text to my image, and then I'm going to call my parent's draw function on myself. And then it's going to go up to button, it's going to call the draw function on the text button, which is just going to blit the text button's image to the text button's rect. Which of course I showed you how it gets that image by going through button and going through rect, by just kind of checking the closest thing to it. And that's essentially how it's drawing itself. So, we have 3 things being drawn, and I know you can't see the clickableRect because, well, it's impossible to see on its own, since it doesn't have an image, it doesn't have any image, it's just a rectangle, some type of obscure zone that essentially when we click it, it's going to, do some action for us. So, we have a button, we have a text button, we have a clickableRect. Let's get to work on actually making these things clickable. Now, just for time concerns and time reasons, I'm probably only going to do the clicking for this video, and it's not going to, have the nice animation where it changed color, and when I was mousing down it changed its, image color so that you can see. It's not going to have the interactivity, but I am going to be able to click all 3 of them. So how do we do that? Well, inside of our clickableRect, we need to do an update. And what's our update going to be inside of here? Well, the update essentially, so the update is basically going to say this. If self.isClicked, so if we are clicked, self.onClick. Or we can say something like self.doClick. So, it kind of makes us understand that this is an action. And this is what's going to happen in our update. So, let's create those 2 functions, because, we're going to need them. Define isClicked. So isClicked, could take the mouse argument if we wanted. I'm just going to grab another copy of the mouse argument so, we can check if it's clicked by saying mouse equals pygame.mouse.getPressed. And then we know that, mouse 0, if it's true, then the left mouse button is being pushed. So how do we know if it's been clicked? Well, the first thing we need to know is we can say something like if is mouse over, or I should be saying if self.isMouseOver, which will be another function we create. So if the mouse is over the button, we are capable of clicking it. Because otherwise, if we click anywhere on the screen, this will return true. So the first thing we need to check is the mouse over it? And if the mouse is over it, then we can check for a click. So we'll create this function later, is mouse over, but right now let's keep on with the clicking logic. So if the mouse is over, we can click it. Well, how do we know if the mouse is down? So if mouse 0, meaning the left mouse button, is down, so if this is true, and self dot has clicked is false, then we know we can click. Because we haven't clicked yet. This says we have not clicked yet, so the left mouse button is currently up, and the left mouse button is down. This is the latch. So if we just said if mouse 0, the left mouse button is held down, then that means we're clicking. In which case, every single frame we check, it's going to return true, and it's going to do something for every single frame. But because we only want this to happen when we click the mouse button down, the first frame the mouse button goes down and is held down, that's the frame we click. And we can only click once before, we have to let go of the mouse button to unset that. And that's what the has clicked variable is for, is just checking that. So if this is true, we know we've clicked. So we're going to return true. And this is going to be a return type function. So isClicked is a return type. So if we say if self.isClicked, well, if this is true, we return true, in which case this goes, okay, it's true, do the click. Otherwise, we return false. So if mouse is down, return true. Otherwise, we need to check if mouse 0 is equal to false. So if the left mouse button is up, then what we're going to do, or how would we say this? If the left mouse button is up and self.hasClicked is true, then what we're going to do is just say self.hasClicked equals false. And when we actually click, we need to say self.hasClicked equals true. Just fix up my syntax here. Now the reason I'm doing this is, say for example this was inside the isMouseOver function. That means only while the mouse is over the button does something happen. So say if we click the button and we move the mouse over, and that's actually an issue in the current example if I open it back up. So what this does is it corrects this problem. The mouse is currently up right now, but that button is green. Because what happened is I clicked down, the left mouse button is being held, I move the mouse outside from being around the mouse button, and I let go of the left mouse button. Because if we only check if the mouse is up when we're over the button, then we'll never, have that clicking motion. We'll have it always go down and always stay down. And I can actually do that for both buttons. Now, this isn't a functionality you want. It's very likely one you don't want. So what this is going to do is, even if we're not over the button, when we release the left mouse button, and self.hasClicked was true, meaning if the left mouse button was down and we just released it, then, make hasClicked equal to false, in which case this will no longer happen because this is now returns negative basically. And this check will only happen once when we release the mouse button. So now we have that working. We set the click to true, and all we have to do now is set a default return, which is just going to be, if we get to this point, just return false. Now what the default return is meant to do is, now what this end return does is it just tells it that if we don't return true, then that means we return false. Now functions that return stuff, all they want to do is return their value and be done, because once they return, they don't have to do any more math. They don't have to do any more calculations or use any more CPU time. So when we say if the mouse is over the button and we can click, and we do click, return true, function cuts out. It just stops here. It stops caring about anything. In which case the next tick, what will happen is we'll check this, because this will return false, we'll come down, check this, and then we'll just return false. So basically, what this setup does is if we clicked, return true. Otherwise, if we have not clicked, just return false. And that's how this function is going to work. Now, we need an isMouseOver function because, we need to know, have we moused over the button so we're capable of clicking it. And we also need a doClick function. Let's come up here and create isMouseOver, because that one's essential. So define isMouseOver. And this one's pretty easy. We just need to get a pygame.mouse.get position, because we need to know the position of the mouse. And then we just say something like if self.rect .left is less than cursor 0, so the x position of the cursor, which is less than self.rect.right, and self.rect.top is less than the cursor at the y position, which is less than self.rect.bottom, then we know our mouse is currently inside the rectangle, in which case, return true. And then, of course, we can say else, return false. Because if we're inside the mouse button, then we're mousing over it. And if we're not inside the mouse button, or not inside the rectangle, then we're not mousing over it. This is a pretty easy function. So we have that. All we need now is doClick. So we'll come here. I'll create this one above the update. So define doClick. And then on the click, what do we want to do? Well, let's just print something in the console because we really are running out of time and we're probably over 30 minutes at this point. So print you clicked a rect. Of course, I want to fix my L. And let's run this. So now, you can't see it, but it's there. Let's click. You clicked a rect. Well, we also have the button. When we click that, nothing happens. And when we click button 3, nothing happens, because only the rect is doing its own update. But if we come down to button and its update, it does a self.draw, and then it does a clickableRect .update on itself with its game window. Then now all 3 buttons will update. So now we can click our rect, you clicked a rect, we can click our button, you clicked a rect, we can click button 3, which is our text button, and it will say you clicked a rect. Now, of course, it's only going to say the one thing because all 3 of them are using the one update function. They're all using this one update function and this one doClick function. However, if we wanted to change this up, say button has its own function, so define doClick. We say print you clicked a button. Then now, when we click the button or the text button, it's going to say you clicked a button. So we click the rect, you clicked a rect, we click the button, you clicked the button, we click the text button, you clicked a button. And even then, maybe the text button has its own doClick function, in which case we can, redefine what this says again. So that's all I'm going to do for this video. We'll finish up these buttons next time to make them, have their full functionality so that they have mouse over effects and they have clicking effects instead of just being able to be clicked. But hopefully you can understand the inheritance part of this, because that was the main purpose of this video, was to show you how the button is able to inherit stuff from the clickableRect and how the text button inherits the button by, saying that the text button is just a button with text, and how the button is a clickableRect with an image, and how the clickableRect is, just a rectangle that in fact can be clicked. Which is why the clickableRect is the most complicated, because it's going to have the most functions. We still have about, I think, 4 functions to add to the clickableRect, and maybe 1 or 2 to the button, depending on how many we want to override. And by override, I mean, the button has a doClick function. This overrides the doClick function in the clickableRect. So because the child has the same named function, this one will always be called when the child or lower calls for it, based on that way I showed you by kind of talking about how when this thing does its draw, or when the text button calls its update function, it goes, okay, I need an update function from text button. It doesn't have one. Let's look in the parent, go to button. Okay, I need an update function. It's got one. And I need a rect. Let's go all the way up to clickableRect and find our self.rect. That type of inheritance. Anyway, hopefully you understand that. I'm going to stop rambling for now. Hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching.